for-profit monopolies. And in Michigan, it's dominated by two very large companies. We all know who they are. They have combined revenues of $19 billion, very, very large companies. And the way they operate, the way they get compensated basically is by making investments in capital, and they get a return on that capital, which is guaranteed at something at 10%, maybe a little bit more. And you can imagine that if you look at the other organizations that also play in this ecosystem, we have 501Cs, who are social welfare organizations. This is often referred to dark money and lobbyists and so forth. We have lawmakers, which do laws that impact the energy industry here in Michigan. And we have the Michigan Public Service Commission, which is chartered with regulating the utilities. But the bottom line is in the left-hand corner there. In the state of Michigan, you probably pay the 13th highest rates in the nation. If you're a commercial account, you pay about 8.3% higher than the national average. And if you're an industrial account, it's about 14.2% higher than the national average. So if you look at what is going on with rates over the last 10 years, they've been going up, not surprising, and they've been outpacing inflation. There's a number of things that are causing it. One is that distributed generation, that is organizations doing their own generation on their facility, either residential or commercial, and energy efficiency, which is, a lot of times as simple as replacing an incandescent light bulb with a LED. It's driving down the revenue of the utilities. In order to stay even, or just to stay even, they have to increase their rates. Natural gas prices today have been pretty low. Will that still be true 10 years from now? Don't know. But if the natural gas prices double 10 years from now, all of that rate risk is on you. It is not on the utility. The utility infrastructure obviously needs upgrades. DT has just gotten approval for $1 billion natural gas plant in, I believe it's New China. And also it's very clear that the grid is badly in need of modernization. Every time a storm goes through, you have thousands of homes that are without power. And so there's going to be a lot of investment that's needed, and that's going to, of course, take money. So the changing economics that's impacting you in solar is that your electric rates are consistently going up. Your utility rates are always going up, and your solar costs, if you had solar, they keep coming down. In fact, I've seen a statistic recently that Michigan solar costs have fallen 47% in the last year. So what's interesting is when you look at that intersection, excuse me, is that solar energy is actually lower cost than the energy that you're buying from the utility. If you invest in solar, it's an inflation hedge, because once you make the investment, you're basically have all the investment, all the infrastructure you need to maintain the energy for the next 25 years. Of course, it's sustainable and healthier. It also supports the local economy. If you look at the way we consume fossil fuels for generating electricity, we're sending billions of dollars to the western states, Wyoming and Montana. Now, I love Wyoming and Montana. They're great places to visit, but I don't necessarily think that sending billions of dollars their way is helping the state of Michigan. So why do so many people think solar is expensive? Well, I think a lot of it is there's just old data and it's bad information. I just cited this statistic that solar costs have fallen 45% in the last year. But probably the number one thing is that you have to pay for 25 to 30 years of electricity up front. You're buying it all up front. So if you pay your electric bill every month, it could be $1,000. You're not paying 25 years of electric bills at $1,000. But with solar, basically, you're getting it all up front. There's another myth too, and that is that some people think Michigan is too cold or too far north. Neither of those is true for solar. That's why you're seeing solar, for example, along the highways and on top of many rooftops. So the falling costs of solar, and guess what? Borrowing, make all the above go away. And I'll go through that as an example, a financial example, in just a few minutes. So when you know the facts, solar looks better and better. And this is why solar is the fastest growing energy source worldwide. When I say when you know the facts, the reality is if everybody knew that the facts about solar, there'd be a lot more interest than there is. But you know, it's hard sometimes to get the word out about solar. So here's what it looks like. When I first started in solar 3 years ago, I kept looking at businesses, and almost a lot of them had flat roofs. But guess what? If you have a flat roof, that's a good thing, because you can literally lay down the racking without drilling any holes, without making any penetration in that roof. You ballast it with concrete blocks. That protects it from the wind. 110, 120 mile an hour wind won't move. You affix the panels to the racking, and you run the conduit to your load center in your building, and you're up and running. It's very fast to install, very cost effective to install. If you have property, land near your building, you can also do ground mount, which is very cost effective. Putting in posts with the rack, attach the racking, and then the modules to the racking. You trench to your building, and you're basically good to go. If you've got a pitched roof, there are solutions for that. One of the questions I most frequently get is, well, what about a steel roof? Well, if you have a standing seam roof, which is pretty common in a steel roof today, that some clever engineer came along and invented a clamp that's specific to standing seam. So you can actually take that clamp without drilling any holes, moving any screws. You can actually attach it to that standing seam, and that is, keeps the solar system in place even during very high wind storms here in Michigan. Again, very, very fast, cost effective to implement. So let's talk a little bit about solar incentives. Solar incentives are very important for solar today. The most important one, and one that gets most people know about, is actually the federal investment tax credit. It's 30% of your investment, of your installation cost, all in installation cost, and it's a dollar for dollar credit. So if you owe $30,000 in taxes and you install a $100,000 system, 30% of the $100,000 will be a tax credit. That $30,000 tax credit will be a dollar for dollar offset for the $30,000 of tax that you would otherwise pay. There's also 100% bonus depreciation. And this was, the bonus depreciation was actually being phased out, but in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which was passed in December in Washington in 2017, December 2017, they not only didn't phase it out, but they increased it from 50% to 100%. In other words, you can take 100% bonus depreciation, not just on the amount that's left over from after the investment tax credit, but 85% of the installed cost. So you get that little extra margin on that. And I'm going to go through the math in an example in just a minute, so I'll leave it there. There is a grant program for areas in western Washtenaw and all across the state of Michigan, by the way. It's the U.S. Department of Agriculture. It's called the Rural Energy for America program, better known as REAP. It's a grant. That is money that you don't need to pay back. It can be up to 25% of the install cost. It's only available in certain locations. They tend to be rural or smaller towns. For example, you do not have REAP in the city of Ann Arbor. But it's easy for me to tell you whether you qualify for REAP. And if you look on the website of the USDA, you can also find out by looking up your own address. Now, the thing about doing REAP, it does require, even though Homeland Solar would do the application for you, it does require your time and effort. So it's not something you should do unless you're willing to commit that time and effort. And the other thing is, it's not guaranteed. You can go through that time and effort, but it won't necessarily succeed. On the other hand, we have a very good track record of succeeding. So one of the things that a lot of people say, well, I mean, I'd love to go solar, but buying 25 years of energy up front, that takes some cash. Well, there's ways of getting around that, which is simply using borrowing. Today, there's an organization called Michigan Saves. It's a great organization. It was established by a grant from the Michigan Public Service Commission. And it's a nonprofit that's dedicated to energy efficiency and saving energy for you. And you can get loans from Michigan Saves up to 12 years on a solar system. In some cases, maybe more. Not only that, but you can actually, if you choose, up to 100% of your investment. So you can actually do it with no money down. And it's very easy to get approval. It's very little amount of paperwork. It's just a really, really good program. And I'll show you what an example of that looks like in just a minute. There's also a program which is probably a more narrowly of interest, and that's called Property Assessed Clean Energy here in Michigan, or PACE. If you have an older building, and older buildings very often waste 30 or 40% of their energy. That energy goes out through an uninsulated roof, uninsulated, poorly insulated walls. You've got a boiler system that's 30 years old, it's 60% efficient. You don't have any modern lighting fixtures. You can lump all that together and do what is called a special property assessment. Instead of taking a loan on it, you can pay for that over, say, 20 years with a special property assessment. And the benefit of that is that it's not listed on your balance sheet. It's actually assigned to your facility, the building itself. And if you sell that building, it goes with the building. But it does not go on your balance sheet as debt. And of course, there are also alternatives from your local bank. So here's an example. Based on your load, very often you will size a system to that load. Now here's an example of an $80,000 system. So as I mentioned before, if you look in the cost summary column, I don't know if you can see my pointer, I guess you can't. Cost summary column, you see the installed cost of $80,000, and in the first year you can take $24,000, 30% of that $80,000 as the investment tax credit, which means that your cost after the investment tax credit is $56,000. Then you get the bonus depreciation, which I mentioned is 85% of the installed cost. It's not taken only the cost after the investment tax credit, it's actually 85% of the install cost, which in this case is $68,000. I used a 30% federal tax rate, which is pretty common with an LLC or an LLP or even an S-Corp that are pass-through organizations. And that would give you a savings of nearly $24,000 in federal taxes and a couple $1,000s in state taxes. So your depreciation tax savings could be as high as $26,000 in this scenario. If you add the $26,000 to your investment tax credit of $24,000, you end up with a net cost after ITC, investment tax credit and depreciation, for as little as $30,000. Now, I don't know if you can see it because I'm going to try to move me here. Yeah, that works. I'm going to move me down. Hopefully that moves me down out of your way. If you look at the financial metrics and results, that $80,000 investment will give you a system which generates 42,000 kilowatt hours per year. And if you price that out at your utility offset, and you're in a utility area that charges 14 cents per kilowatt hour, that's nearly $6,000 per year. If you take your $30,000 net cost after ITC and depreciation and divide it by that $6,000 utility savings, you can see that you can get a simple payback of 5 years. I say simple payback, that's the way most people would calculate payback, but there's some subtleties to it that will make it a little bit longer than that, and I'll talk about that in just a second. The solar internal rate of return can be as high as 10% or more. And when I made the bold claim that solar energy is cheaper than what you pay for a utility, well, you pay 14 cents very often, 12 to 14 cents from the utility. The solar cost of energy in this scenario is less than 4 cents. Now, what is that solar cost of energy? It's a very simple calculation. It's your net cost after ITC and depreciation plus your operations and maintenance cost over 25 years. You add those numbers together and you divide it by the number of kilowatt hours that it generates, that system will generate over 25 years, and that gives you a dollar cost per kilowatt hour. And that, in this case, is about 3.3 cents. So it is indeed less than 14 cents per kilowatt hour. In fact, it is considerably less than 14 cents per kilowatt hour. So if you borrow, and don't try to read the table on the left, because I'm going to, in just a second, I'm going to make it bigger. If you look at borrowing at 6.5% interest with a 12-year term loan and putting $24,000 up front, I picked that number because that's the amount of the investment tax credit that you will get back in the first year. You will be cash flow positive in the first year and in every year through the 25 years. You will always be cash flow positive. And if you look at the column that's third from the right, where it's got all those red numbers, even though they're red, those are actually good. And that's because by making this investment, you are going to be more profitable in every single year. And that means you're going to be paying more taxes. The more money you make, the more taxes you pay. And this model actually shows you that extra tax liability. So the important thing to know about return on investment with a solar system, it's very low risk. Electricity is here to stay. You will still be using electricity in that building 25 years from now. And it's always good to compare a 4 cent per kilowatt hour to whatever you think the utility rate will be 25 years from now. So let's take a look at the numbers in a little bit larger. I already mentioned the cumulative cash flow on the right as being positive every year. If you look at the change in federal tax liability, those red numbers mean you're making more money than you would have otherwise. If you look at the left, the second column, the financing payments on the left, with all the red numbers, that's what you're going to be paying in terms of servicing your loan. But if you look at the black column called electric bill savings, that's what you're going to be saving. So what you're looking at, say, I'll just use example year 4. If you can see year 4 there, it says, I wish I had a pointer. It says $6,733 to service your debt, and you're offsetting $6,073 of electric savings. That's about $600 some. But if you didn't make this investment, you'd be paying $6,000. So when you look at the ongoing costs, a lot of people just install and forget. The product warranties on the equipment actually extend through the payback. So if you look at that picture there on the right, you see the solar panels. There's something there called an inverter, and then there's the meter that you already have, and that meter basically is there to so the utility can tell you how much energy you're buying from them. When you have the inverter itself, basically takes direct current from your panels and converts it to alternative current, which is compatible with all your usage in your building, as well as compatible with the grid. So if you look at the panels first, from the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, which is part of the Department of Energy, they said the failure rate for panels is 5 out of 10,000 panels each year. That's a 0.05% failure rate. They have no moving parts. They do not fail very often. They come with 10-year product warranties, and they come with something called a performance warranty for 25 years. That says that that panel will be producing 80% of its nameplate capacity, what it was rated at when it was sold, after 25 years. So you've got both a product warranty and a performance warranty. Inverters are your most likely thing to fail in the 25-year time frame. They don't necessarily fail, but if they do, they typically fail in the 15 to 20-year time frame. But you can get an extended warranty if you like. It is available. And of course, they're a relatively small component of the cost of a solar system compared to the labor of doing all the installation of all of the panels themselves. So what business is a good, is suitable for solar? Well, it's really any business that uses electricity, but you find a lot of companies. We have a lot of customers, for example, in agriculture, medical practices, retailers. This picture on the far right, where it says retail, dealers, and services, that's actually the roof of the Michigan Theater. Offices and warehouses. Here's an example of the flat roof that I showed you before. Or in manufacturing, where here's a ground mount system at a system out by Dexter. But is every business a solar prospect? Well, here's the questions you should ask. Do you own or lease your building? If you own the building, it's easy. If you lease the building, you may need to get an agreement from your landlord. And if your lease expires before 25 years, which it almost certainly will, you would want to have some agreement in place for the landlord owning the system after you discontinue your lease. Is there plenty of sunshine at your site? This is the key thing. If you have trees overlooking your building, if there are adjacent buildings that cast big shadows on your rooftop, if you have a cluttered rooftop. I showed you a very clean rooftop. Not every rooftop is that way. Some have HVAC units, venting units, standpipes, chimneys, wires. I mean, some of them are very cluttered and not ideal. But probably the most important thing for determining the viability of solar is, do you pay taxes? Because many of these incentives are only available if you pay taxes. You can't get the investment tax credit, for example, if you don't pay taxes. You can't take depreciation expenses if you don't pay taxes. So that's the key. So one of the things that is very important to the viability of solar is what they call net metering. I've been to a number of meetings that very often creates quite a bit of confusion and misunderstanding. I'll try to keep it as simple as possible. Most of your solar generation that you own will be behind the meter. That is, your existing loads in your facility will consume what you produce. It's behind the meter. But when solar production is greater than what you're consuming locally, then that excess electricity will flow to the grid. And net metering is a way of compensating you for contributing that overgeneration to the grid. And there basically are two ways of compensating that. One is full net metering, which is parity. What you send out and what you get back basically has the same value. And then there's modified, which basically is a lower rate, which is typically in the neighborhood of 8 cents per kilowatt hour, not the full 12 to 14 cents per kilowatt hour. So in effect, the utility and the grid acts as a giant battery in your service. But in 2016, the Michigan legislature passed an energy reform and overhaul bill that called for the replacement of net metering with something called a distributed generation tariff. And then they gave the Michigan Public Service Commission the task with fairly valuing that overgeneration that you send to the grid. And the MPSC, the Michigan Public Service Commission, came back with you've avoided cost model to use for valuing that electricity, which everybody in the solar industry thinks is a perfectly fair way of valuing it. In the DTE rate case, which was filed in July 2018, that's a U-20162. Hard to find information about it. It's a big document. They basically slashed the overgeneration credit to about 3 to 4 cents per kilowatt hour. Now, I want to point this out. This is their opening, okay? The Michigan Public Service Commission ultimately approves this. So this is far from a done deal. There's going to be a lot of resistance to that low paying rate, because they take that same 3 or 4 cents per kilowatt hour, they put it out on the grid, send it to your next door neighbor, and they'll charge your next door neighbor 20 cents per kilowatt hour if that customer, that neighbor, happens to be on the D1.8 time of use rate. So there's a big gap there, as you can see. They also want to charge you for your investment. They all want to charge you $2.30 for every kilowatt hour you put on your roof or in your or on your facility. $2.30 per kilowatt each month. So if you have a $100 100 kilowatt system, that's $230 every month. That's a lot of money. And you're asking, what do you get for that? Not much. So if you enroll, though, this is an important note. If you enroll before May of 2019, you can be grandfathered into the current net metering, 10 years of grandfathering. Now, who knows what it's going to be, what's going to turn out to be in May of 2019, what the ultimate credit's going to be. But this is your alternative. If you are enrolled, you will automatically get the 10-year grandfather in the current net metering. So let's now, I'm almost finished. Let's look at Washtenaw County. If you see the picture on the right, you can see Ann Arbor, you can see Chelsea, and you can see all the townships all with their names on them. There are three utilities I'm going to talk about: Consumers Energy, obviously DTE, and Chelsea Electric. Consumers and DTE are investor owned. Chelsea is municipal owned and a nonprofit. So Consumers territory is generally west of Chelsea, I believe. That would be Linden, Sylvan, and Manchester and Sharon. And DTE is all the rest of the county, with the exception of the city of Chelsea. So if you're sitting in the city of Chelsea, you might be paying, a business might be paying 10.5 cents per kilowatt hour. Your neighbor, your other business to the west might be paying 14 cents per kilowatt hour. And if you're to the east, you might be paying 12 cents per kilowatt hour. But there aren't just single rates. This is an important thing a lot of people don't know. Most people think that rates, like on your residence, for example, kilowatt hours, just how much you use. But the utilities also have something called demand rates, which charge you not only for how much you use, but how you use it, your peak demand. And they've also introduced more recently time of use rates, which vary time of day. They charge a different rate for in the middle of the night than they do during the peak of the day. So there are all these choices that you have in terms of what rates that you have. The way I would describe energy is you get a gallon bucket, you fill it up, take it to the counter, they say, you bought a gallon, cost that amount of money. In demand rates, if you turn on the faucet real fast when you're filling up that bucket, and then you take that same gallon to the counter, they will charge you more because of your peak demand, because of all the water that was splashing out, I guess. And then if it's time of use, they will charge you the different kilowatt hour in the morning, then they charge you at noon, they charge you at night. So most companies are going to be secondary. The larger companies are typically primary. The difference is who owns the transformer. In a primary account, the customer owns the transformer, and a secondary account, it's the utility that owns the transformer. You are most likely secondary. You will see your transformers if you look at the pole outside your building. There'll be a bunch of cylinders up there, 3, 1, whatever it might be. Or you might even, if you're a larger secondary customer, you might even have something sitting on the ground. But if you are a consumer's customer, you have 3 different rates: a demand rate, an energy rate, and a time of use rate. And if you're DTE, you have a demand rate and an energy rate. They also have a time of use rate, but it's not viable. Nobody signs up for it because it's just too high, too expensive. So they have it, but you should not use it. So it's confusing, but here is what you need to know. It's not just how much energy you use, it's how you use your energy. Many businesses actually don't understand their own load profile. They don't know when they're using energy. They also don't understand invoices. If you look at an invoice, you'll see at the last page they'll have a charge called A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H. I mean, they're really very complicated. And of course, many don't know their rights. So for example, in that case of different rates, if you're on a rate that you're paying more than you should be because you're on the wrong rate, the utility has no obligation to let you know that. But you do have the right to get one free, I will call it an electric rate analysis per year. And it's as simple as calling the Utility Business Support Center and asking for an electric rate analysis. And what that is they look at your most recent 12 months of usage, and then they price it out for each of the rates that are available to you. And you can clearly see whether your rate is the best rate compared to the other rates that are available. So once you do that, if you see there's a more advantageous rate, once a year, because you can't keep switching rates, just whenever you feel like it, but once a year you can change to a new rate. And the assumption that if you're going to change to a new rate is that your electric load profile, your consumption profile, is the same in the upcoming 12 months. If you have a big change planned, so for example, if you're going to refit all of your lights from fluorescent to LED, or if you're going to add a second shift, whatever the situation is, you may think twice about shifting to a new rate structure. But lest you think there's no benefit to this, I'm going to give you some of my own examples. A small fabricator saved $30,000 a year. That was about 30% of their electric bill because they are on a demand rate. All they had to do is move from a demand rate to an energy rate. Washtenaw manufacturer saved $6,000 per year. All they had to do is move from a demand rate to an energy rate. A Grand Rapids retail complex saved $50,000 a year. Granted, that was only 10% of their electric usage, big user. And if you look at that, 50,000, about 10%. An ice rink saved $20,000 a year. That was about 5% by moving from demand rates to time of use. I think the Grand Rapids retail complex that went from energy to time of use. So there's a message here that if you have the type of business that consumes a lot of energy, say in the early evening hours or even overnight, then you may benefit from this time of use rate. Most companies won't, but some will. So anyway, the best thing to do is if you call the Business Support Center, is have them give you one of these electric rate analysis. Or call me, and I can tell you just by looking at an invoice whether it's worth your time to go through that. Consumers is outstanding at responding to these kinds of requests. DTE seems to take longer, I'll put it that way, and I'll move on. So I'm pretty much summarizing now. Why now? Why not wait? Well, the investment tax credit is here. It'll start phasing out, but not until 2020. Net metering is being replaced by distributed generation. If you are a DTE customer, that could impact you, will probably impact you in May of 2019. It'll be later for Consumers Energy. Consumers Energy has not yet filed its rate case. But if you act now, you'll be grandfathered into net metering for 10 years. And you can always opt for the other if it turns out to be better. And if you're interested in tax this year, 2018, your system must not be just constructed and installed, but it must be actually operating, placed in service, permission to operate by the end of the year, by December 31st. You get bad weather in December, you get people on vacation, so it's better if you're interested in this year, you better start soon. I personally believe it's not a question of if you will own solar, it's a question of when you will own solar. So how to proceed? Very quickly, best thing to do is pick up the phone or email. I'm going to give you my contact information, but you can call any installer. They will typically, or I would ask you for a utility invoice because it's important in terms of knowing solar is how much you're using. You can install a system that's greater than your consumption. The utility won't pay you for the overconsumption, overproduction. You will be donating that. You don't want to do that. Take time to understand your solar investment and get to know your solar installer. It's a substantial investment, so you should take the time. Consider the financial impact on your business, which I'm sure you will, and I would be more than happy to quantify that for you. Review the proposal, and that's what it takes to own your own power. Just make the decision. So there's no better time than now. That's my phone number. Feel free to call me if you want consultation on your electric rates, whether you're interested in solar or not. I'm happy to provide that to you. No cost, no obligation. If you want me to assess your solar potential and give you some idea of your financial return, I can do that. If you want a proposal, I can do that. All for you. That's my number. That's my email. So with that, Alan, I am going to open it up for questions.
All right, Larry. So far, I have no questions. So if you're listening on Facebook Live, please type in a question if you have one. If you're on the webinar, please go to the Q&A and type in your question.
Well, I went pretty fast.
You did very well. It was about 35 minutes.
Okay. A lot there. Seeing it I found a lot of people aren't familiar with the content I just presented. So it's a lot to take on all in one big thing. One 30-minute presentation.
Yeah. No, you did very well. So this will be, I'm going to stop the recording now.
No questions?
No questions.